6 of Introduction to Psychology. This week's microlesson is on social influence and facilitation. Social influence refers to the process by which an individual's behavior is changed by actions and expectations of others. Social influence ranges from mild to strong. Mere presence is the most mild form of social influence, and coercion is the most intense form of social influence. Presence, the most mild form of social influence, is the tendency of people to change their behavior due to the presence of other people. Two common forms of mere presence are social facilitation and social loafing. Social facilitation is the tendency to perform better when in the presence of others. Now, this only really works when we feel confident in our performance. When we're not confident in our performance or feel as if we may not be able to perform well, our performance will likely decline in the presence of other people. Social loafing is the tendency for individuals to work harder when they're solely responsible for work rather than when they share responsibility for work with others. And many of us have experienced this working in a group and where we maybe do all the work associated with the group and others just kind of ride on our coattails. Conformity is the process by which an individual's behavior is brought into agreement with the actions, norms, and values of others without being directly pressured to do so. So some definitions from this definition that are important to understand. Norms. Norms are a widely accepted and sometimes unspoken, often unspoken, standard about conduct for appropriate behavior. So in other words, norms are what we expect everyone in our group and around us to comply to. All groups have norms, whether those are formal groups or informal groups. An example would be if we're driving down the street, as this picture depicts, and we are in a traffic jam, we expect that all drivers remain in their place and don't weave in and out or go on the right-hand shoulder. And when they do, they're violating the norm, and it can be upsetting. The broadest norms defined by our society or by any society establish what is considered normal. So whenever you hear somebody say, well, it's normal to, whatever that is, or something is not normal, what they're really saying is that it violates or is in alignment with the norm. Hairstyles, habits, habits of speech, dress, eating, rules, laws, and social customs are all normative. In other words, they all have pressure from the larger group, the society, to be as standardized as possible. Norms and the tendency to conform to norms allows individuals to anticipate the actions of others. So you can imagine if no one who was, or even a few people, failed to obey the norms of driving, for example, it'd be awfully scary because as an individual driver, you wouldn't be able to anticipate the driver next to you, what that individual's behavior and driving pattern is likely to be. And so it would be very chaotic and scary and probably pretty dangerous as well. It's probably not surprising to hear that some people are more likely to conform than others. So individuals who are more likely to conform to society or group norms include people with high needs for structure or certainty, individuals who are anxious or have low confidence or are concerned with the approval of others, and individuals living in cultures that emphasize group cooperation, such as many Asian cultures. So on the previous slide, we talked about some of the benefits of conformity. So knowing what to expect when you're driving, for example. One of the drawbacks of conformity is something that's referred to as groupthink. And groupthink is a desire and a tendency by decision-making groups to maintain agreement, even at the cost of critical thinking. And they do this by rewarding conformity, so it's more important to stay in line than to think critically or creatively. There might even be group sanctions or punishment for the nonconformity. So anyone who thinks outside of the box or offers an alternative way of approaching something may be actually punished and sanctioned, ignored maybe, or shunned. Groupthink results from the tendency for some individuals to feel that it's more important to belong to a group than it is to be an individual. So the more that someone believes that belonging to the group is more important than expressing him or herself individually, the more likely the individual is to conform, and to conform in a way that results in group thinking. Other pressures for conformity, individuals are more likely to conform if the conforming group is already large. So if everybody's doing it, or there's a perception that everybody's doing it, it's more likely that an individual will choose to engage in that behavior as well. And it's less likely to occur if at least one person agrees with you. And so one of the things to think about, and Margaret Mead maybe said it the best, so she said, never underestimate the power of a small committed group of individuals to change the world. And really what she meant by that is when some people, when even a few people are willing to speak out or challenge the status quo or think creatively or come up with solutions that are outside of the norm, that really does possibly have huge impact on the world, because others are likely to stand up and in solidarity with this group, even if it's a small group, as long as there's some people standing up and offering alternative thinking. Science is the changing of our behavior at the request of a person who has little or no authority. And so an example might be that we will sit and suffer without protest while someone near us talks loudly as we're trying to study, rather than saying something and asking that person to change their behavior. The person talking loudly nearby while we try to study has no real authority over us, but yet we adjust our own behavior rather than making a request. We are more likely to comply under 3 conditions. If the request comes from someone we know rather than a stranger, and the request can be an overt request, like asking of a favor. It can also be an implicit request, which is asking of something without actually using words. So for example, if someone's talking very loudly while you're trying to study, well then implicitly they're asking you to put up with them talking very loudly while they study. So it doesn't have to be an overt request, something that's done directly to you. We're also more likely to comply if, in fact, we have complied in that way in the past. And we're all likely to comply, more likely to comply, if it allows us to reciprocate a prior gift, favor, or service. So think about this. Oftentimes when somebody's trying to sell you something, think about walking through the mall, for instance, and they want to sell you, a vendor might want to sell you hand cream. They're going to first put a squirt of hand cream on your hand and have you rub it in, and now they've got you because they have you feeling as if you should listen to their sales pitch simply because they gave you some free hand cream prior to asking you to listen to their sales pitch. 2 main forms of getting compliance. One is called foot in the door effect. So a person who first agrees to a small request is later more likely to comply with a larger demand. So one of the things that I often teach parents when I'm working with parents who have children who maybe are very challenging, or they just want support to help in the area of discipline, is if you want your child to do something that's fairly aversive, or they're not going to really want to do it, or it's a big task, is to first ask them to do something very little, and then maybe something kind of medium before you ask them to do the bigger task. And that, in fact, by doing that, it's called foot in the door, they're much more likely to agree to doing the larger task because they've already agreed to doing the smaller task. The door in the face effect is really the opposite. So it's the tendency for a person who has refused a major request to agree to a much smaller request. So for example, we might ask our neighbor, would it be okay if I borrowed your car to drive to the airport because I'm going and leave it there for 2 days as I fly for my business trip? Of course, most neighbors are going to say, I'm so sorry, but that can't happen. But if we requested that, and then when they refused said, oh, okay, I understand, would you be willing to drive me to the airport? They're actually much more likely to say, yes, I will drive you to the airport, than if you didn't first kind of present this other option that is very large and kind of aversive. Obedience is the changing of one's behavior in response to the demands of an authority figure. This week, you read about Milgram's obedience studies. And as you recall, Milgram did a study where he asked students, graduate students, to sit in one room with a scientist or a researcher and administer increasing level of intensity of shocks, volts, electric volts, to another volunteer who was seated in the next room. Now, what we know is that there really wasn't anyone seated in the next room, and in fact, Milgram's researchers simply had a recording of an individual that they would play each time the graduate student would administer a shock. And over time, the graduate student was asked to administer higher and higher and higher volumes of shocks and intensity of shocks. And in the other room, it sounded as if the person who was receiving the shocks was begging not to be shocked anymore, was telling them to please stop, and then at one point was actually pretty silent, indicating that the person had either died or was unconscious. And while Milgram in the beginning of his study predicted that only a small, very small percentage of individuals would be willing to follow the instructions of the researchers and administer the shocks once the individual in the other room began to protest, what he found was that, in fact, 65% of people obeyed with these orders. And then when interviewed later, the response to why were you willing to shock somebody in the other room, even though they were begging and it seemed as if they were being harmed, their response was because I was told to by an authority figure. And so it really helps to explain, helps us to understand how things like Nazi Germany happen. Like, how is it that people who were probably pretty normal in terms of their everyday lives become Nazi soldiers who usher millions of victims through concentration camps? And so really it's the same premise, that the obedience is really facilitated by the fact that individuals feel less personally responsible for their own actions when they believe that those actions are the direct result of an authority telling them to do so. Coercion is being forced to change your beliefs or behaviors against your will. It's the most extreme type of social influence. Brainwashing is an example of coercion, and it's the forced attitude change. Brainwashing requires a captive audience. So for example, you have to have some kind of authority over ensuring that your audience cannot escape your demands to change their beliefs or behavior. It's facilitated by making the individual feel helpless or uncomfortable until they agree, and then rewarding them once they agree. So sometimes we see this with individuals who are prisoner of war, for example. So they're made to feel very, very uncomfortable, they feel helpless, they're absolutely captive, and that they are put through an immense amount of torture and pain, and then as soon as they comply, as soon as they begin to agree with the beliefs or behaviors of their captors, they're then rewarded and provided more freedom and more luxuries, for lack of a better word. Brainwashing can actually be reversed rather easily with separation from that situation and with new information. So it does take deprogramming, so we have to go through a process of kind of providing new information, providing the individual a safe place to be able to process the information, but it can be reversed. So some individuals are more susceptible to coercion. These individuals include those who are suffering from an identity confusion. So oftentimes in adolescents are kind of trying to figure out who they are and who they are in the world and who they want to be in the world. And in fact, they are more susceptible to the recruitment by coercive groups as a result. Thank you for taking the time to watch this week's micro lesson. Please reach out if you have any questions or would like to discuss this topic in more depth.